Hey everyone, and welcome to another brand new video. Tonight we have 2 hours of horror stories in no particular order as per usual. Stories from diving adventures, haunted houses, just a whole bunch of stuff. This is a really solid lineup. If you do enjoy it, please be sure to drop a like rating. Let's go for 1,000 likes. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated as I post content just like this all of the time. Wanted to say a quick thank you for all of the recent support. The last couple videos have done extraordinarily well, so I do plan on sticking with this format for the foreseeable future. Yeah, I don't know, the past year has been pretty wild. And sometimes it can be really hard to keep up with this channel. Sometimes it can be really hard to even remember that I have this channel. For those of you that don't know, I am trans. I started HRT in November of last year. So I recently hit 7 months on estrogen, which is really cool. And also I moved into my own place at the end of last year. So there's been just a lot of adjustments in my personal life. And I'm really proud of myself for keeping this channel going as well as I have. Next month I am going to be gone for a couple weeks. I'm going across the country to go see my girlfriend again. Super excited for that. I haven't seen her in a few months, so really pumped for that. I am going to be scheduling videos out for it though, so even though I'll be gone, I won't be replying to comments or anything. There will still be content going up, so don't worry about that. But yeah, I don't know, just a small little update on what's going on in my life. Things are going pretty well, and I'm really happy with where the channel's at. Anyway, enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I was sitting on a crowded train when I felt the stare of a person across from me. Feeling uncomfortable, I slipped my hand into my pocket to retrieve my phone. Feeling nothing but fabric, I began to slightly panic. I leaned forward to check my back pockets. Nothing. My purse. Nothing. I must have dropped it somewhere. Feeling optimistic that it was on the floor of the train, I looked up to ask someone to borrow their phone. The stranger across from me was gone. I turned to the man next to me and asked if I could borrow his phone. I felt grateful as he agreed, and hurriedly dialed my number. Thankfully, I heard it ringing nearby. With the man's phone still in my ear, I looked around on the floor. I couldn't tell which direction the ringing was coming from, but I knew it must be nearby. Then, something strange happened. Someone answered. "Hello?" I said. There was a pause. "Hello?" I repeated. "I need you to listen to me. What I'm going to say will be hard for you to hear." I was dumbstruck. I easily recognized the voice. It was my voice. "You are shocked. I understand the feeling, but you must do what everything I'm about to say." I laughed. This is a very good prank, and I'm got, so whoever is doing this, we are going to die. I stopped laughing. "Okay, I'll bite. What do you want me to do?" "Get off at the next stop and run as fast as you can." "Where?" "Somewhere only we know about. A place you've never shown anyone." "Oh," I said. "Like, don't say it. Just go." The call ends. Still in a haze, I hand the phone back to its owner and sit down. As I do, I feel the train stop. I do as I said and get off. As soon as my feet touch the pavement, I sprint to the place only I know of. There's an old sequoia tree that grows by a river. It's a mile run from the edge of the city. Luckily, that's exactly where the train stopped. I'm halfway there and my legs are on fire. At this point, I want to stop. This was ridiculous, but ultimately, I decided to trust myself. As I finally arrive, I slump to my knees by the riverside and scoop handfuls of water into my mouth. Still on the ground, I hear a man laughing behind me. I turn to see him standing within point-blank range, holding a handgun. I freeze. The man laughs harder. This always gets me. He pretends to wipe a tear from the corner of his eye. "You sure are a creature of habit, aren't you?" I shuffle backward and land partially in the water. He sobers up a bit. Do you know that you pick the same place every time? I mean, it makes my job easier, but really? Some variated thinking might just save your life next time. He pauses. Oh well. Till then. He pulls the trigger. I don't feel pain, only pressure and the feel of the cold wind going through me. All at once, it's black. I gasp awake. I'm on the train. I think I may have been dreaming. Straightening in my seat, I try to recall my dream in its entirety. It's all too fuzzy and I give up. I look up to see a man across from me still staring. Feeling uncomfortable, I reach into my pocket and pull out my phone. As I do, I receive a call from a number I don't recognize. Typically I would ignore it, but I felt compelled to answer. Hello? The person on the other line says. I was shocked. Despite everything becoming clear, I easily recognized the voice. Several months ago, my partner and I moved into our first apartment. It was small and simple, 2 bedrooms, a decent-sized bathroom with a clean shower, and a small living room that connected directly with an even smaller kitchen. We were in love with it from day one. Those first few weeks getting used to our new home were some of the best days of my life. Finally being out from under the noses of our parents and starting our lives together was something I'd been looking forward to for what felt like ages. For a while, everything seemed too good to be true, but then one night, I woke up with a painful need for the bathroom. I laid there for a bit, half asleep, trying to will my body to suck it up and wait just a few more hours. After several minutes of hopelessly tossing around in an attempt to get comfortable, it became clear that the floodgates would soon open past the point of no return. I grumpily forced my tired legs out of bed and headed to the bathroom. After I was done with my business, I groggily fell back into bed next to my partner and yawned in exhaustion. The tears that stung my eyes as a result distorted the room into a series of blurred colors and shadows. Annoyed by the slight inconvenience, I wiped the wet from my face. In doing so, my eyes came to rest on the bedroom doorway. All at once, I felt sleep release me from its temptation as I stared, puzzled, at the doorframe. Something about it looked odd, but without my glasses, I couldn't quite make out what. I reached to my nightstand and searched blindly for my lenses, not taking my eyes off the entrance to our room. After a few seconds of struggling, I managed to grab hold of my glasses and put them on. I have never regretted anything more in my life. It took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the sudden shock of visibility, but as they did, a chill like cold liquid oozed down my back. I saw, peeking around the door frame, a shape. Just a thin section of the side of a large head poked out into the bedroom. Along with it, a pitch-black limb reached around the frame and held it intimately. Despite not being able to make out any clear features on the dark shape, I knew it was looking back at me. I gasped and immediately turned on the light to reveal what was obviously an intruder, only to be met with the abrupt emptiness of my bedroom entrance. Confused but still very much alarmed, I got back out of bed and grabbed the knife I kept in the bedside drawer. I walked cautiously over to the door, weapon at the ready in case I needed to defend myself. I waited, pressed against the wall, listening for any unusual sounds coming from the apartment. When I heard none, it gave me the courage to whip around into the doorway only to see nothing. The hallway was completely empty, and all the doors were shut tight. I slowly moved down the small hall until I reached the living room, where I was once again greeted by no other presence. I sighed in relief. I thought I had just imagined the dark shape. After double-checking the other room and the bathroom just to be safe, I found nothing out of the ordinary. I reasoned that my sleepy mind had just played a trick on me, so I returned to bed once more and looked back at the doorway. I didn't see the figure this time, and after not long, fell back to sleep. The next day, I decided not to share the previous night's excursion with my partner. There was no reason they needed to know about some weird hallucination after all. I went through the day like nothing happened. The mundane of my usual activities, scrubbing away the event until I'd nearly forgotten about it entirely. It wasn't until night fell when I was laying in bed next to my sleeping partner again that my memory came back to me. I bolted upright and stared at the entrance to my bedroom once again. This time, however, it was deserted. I could see only the beige, chipping paint peeling gently from the frame. Relieved and feeling a bit ridiculous, I chuckled silently to myself and looked down at my partner, whose slumbering form hadn't stirred even slightly. The peaceful image brought a tiredness to my eyes, and I opted to rest my head on the feather-ridden pillow beside them and share in that peace. Soon enough, I too was asleep. Sometime later, I awoke without warning. I realized I'd been so distracted before that I'd fallen asleep with my glasses still wrapped around my now indented and weary face. I sat up with a fatigued, quiet sigh of mild annoyance and reached to my face to remove the crooked rims. But as my hand grazed their edges, I opened my eyes a little just by chance and was greeted with a recognizable shape lingering just at the edge of my doorway. My stomach sank like a stone and my abdomen curled and twisted like a coiling serpent as anxiety flooded my veins. There was no mistaking it this time. Impregnating the entrance stood a dark figure, its horrible, misshapen form peeking through the edges of the door frame. I once again sat there in stunned silence, only able to return the thing's faceless peeping with my own horrified gaze. I've no idea how long our staring contest lasted, but after what I'd guess was several minutes, I noticed just a little more of what I thought to be the thing's face was revealed. I could now see what appeared to be half of an unusually inflated, bulbous, human-like head leering at me through the doorway. I then realized its entire crooked arm now reached past the frame, resting a sharp and jagged hand against the bedroom wall. I didn't take the time to observe any more of the thing's hideous form, and instead reached for my knife. I did so slowly, and with an unshifting gaze, the thought of making any sudden movements filling my heart with a paranoid dread. As soon as my hand grasped the handle of the tool, I flipped it open with a low click, and brought it in front of myself. Almost immediately, the pattern of horror that stared me down reacted, but not in the way I'd expected. Rather than rush past me with a fearsome howl or vicious anger, it quickly pulled its gnarled appendage and bulging head back through the doorway, leaving a confused emptiness where it had formerly stood. I almost yelped in surprise and found myself hastily jumping from my bed and storming to the door as if to chase the thing. But as I stepped through the doorway and down the hall, just like the previous night, I found not so much as a dust particle out of place. Unlike the last time, however, I was certain I wasn't imagining things and made little effort to be quiet with my search of the apartment. My stomping feet and slamming of doors unsurprisingly woke my partner, who asked me what was wrong with a tone more irritated than concerned. I can't say I blamed them since my exasperated explanation was unable to describe properly what I'd seen. After double-checking the locks on both the front door and all the windows, as well as searching every room and closet in the apartment, my partner could only conclude that I had some sort of sleep paralysis episode. I tried to explain to them that I'd reached for the knife while watching the shape and therefore couldn't have possibly been asleep, but I think their exhaustion clouded their better judgment. They shook off my concerns and told me to come back to bed with them. I begrudgingly did so, but only because we had basically ripped our home apart to ensure there was no hiding intruders. I didn't do too much throughout the following day, my focus remaining on the entity from the previous night. With my partner being gone to work and leaving me alone, my nerves refused to settle. I kept myself in the living room and close to the front door in case I needed to escape something that might materialize from the shadows that stretched and twisted perfidiously. down the length of the dimly lit hallway. I found it nearly impossible to stop myself from regularly glancing down toward the bedroom, each time expecting to see that malignant shape peeking around its entrance. The place that had once brought me the comfort of a prominent life and a promising future now replaced the very marrow in my bones with a turbulent angst. As the daylight coming through the blind softened, my paranoia only increased. But the image of my partner finally arriving back through the front door brought me at least some amenity. Soon, however, the sun slipped over the mountains. The shadows formerly cast upon the walls began to meld with the increasing darkness of the apartment, and I slowly began to feel less reassured by the thought of my partner's return. They should have been home over an hour before. I shuddered at the possibility that this would be one of those rare evenings when work kept them late. Sadly, a disheartening phone call from my partner confirmed my fear, as they told me in no uncertain terms that they likely wouldn't be relieved until quite late into the night. I tried not to make the dread that overtook me known to them as we spoke. I attempted to hold them on the line longer than what their employer was probably happy with, but inevitably, the conversation had to end, and when it did, I found myself alone once more. Trepidation wrapped itself around my throat like a knotted rope as I stared down the hall to my bedroom. My home suddenly felt like a prison of drywall and cheap, shabby furniture. It was already getting late, and I wasn't sure what I feared more, being alone in the bedroom where that thing might watch me again, or not being alone in the hallway with it. My only hope was that the horror wouldn't show itself that night, but truthfully, I had little reason to believe that. After a day of constantly looking over my shoulder in a ceaseless paranoia, I found myself frustrated that I no longer felt welcome in my own home. I couldn't allow some delusion or nightmare or whatever this thing was to take away the sanctuary my partner and I waited so long to acquire. So it was with a flimsy resolve that I opted to go to sleep in my bed, in my bedroom. Although I decided it would be best to shut the door and lock it in the hopes of bringing myself a little more confidence. It must have been exhaustion from the day's obsessive stress that cradled me into slumber that night. Despite my incessant fear, I somehow managed a few hours of sleep. Late into the night, however, I was awoken to the sound of a light knocking at the bedroom door. I groggily checked the time and realized it must be my partner. Home from work at last. I sighed, a bit relieved, as I forced my body out of the comfort of bed to answer. As I rose, the knocking came again, a little more intensely this time. Slightly irritated, I sleepily announced to my caller to wait a moment as I was coming. I rubbed the tiredness from my eyes as I walked those few short steps to the door. All the while, the perpetual knocking tapped away at it. I again, more loudly this time, announced I was coming and wrapped my hand around the doorknob, preparing to twist its lock and open it. But as soon as my fingers grazed the brass, a heavy bang hit the door so hard the hinges rattled. I jumped back, fear abruptly sobering me, my gaze transfixed on the door like I was trying to see through it. I weakly called my partner's name. Whomever was on the other side responded with yet another slam against the hardboard. I let out a small yelp as the thin strand of resolve I've had earlier that night evaporated completely. Another slam pounded the door, and I watched as a screw flew off one of its hinges. I ran to the door and pressed myself into it with all my weight, hoping to soften the bludgeoning. It rattled again, the force of which nearly threw me off. I planted my feet as hard as was possible on the old carpet and kept pushing against my intruder on the other side. With another loud bang, more shrapnel shot out from the hinges as I desperately tried to keep the door in its frame. I heard the sound of splintering wood and loose, swinging hinges as the attacker continued to assault the barrier between us. I screamed in panic and primitive instinct as I felt the door weaken with each devastating blow. My eyes wildly scanned the small room for anything that could offer protection. I wasn't strong enough to move any of the heavy furniture, and even if I had been there, wasn't enough time to do so. Finally, my distressed gaze landed on my bedside knife. I knew it wouldn't offer much protection against whatever the hell was destroying the door, but as cracks began to form in the wood, I saw little other choice. After guarding against one last slam of the door, I tore myself away from it and ran to the far side of the bed where my small protective item rested. Grabbing it, I turned to face the door, which continued to pound against the now awkwardly misshapen hinges that barely held on. With one final crash, the door flew open and smashed against the wall with a heavy crack, driving the knob clean through it. I expected to see the full form of some kind of behemoth standing murderously in the entrance, but instead there was just that, a doorway, completely desolate of either person or monstrosity. In spite of this, my nerves did not settle. The sight of the empty doorway only brought concern for my sanity as my mind grasped frantically for any kind of explanation to the damn door practically flying off its hinges. I had little time to consider the possibilities, however, for only seconds later the answer revealed itself to me. An absurdly large, swollen black head slowly pushed its way into the room and twisted in a nearly human-like manner until the front of its horrible form rested an eyeless gaze upon me. A deep dread slithered its way up my spine as I glared in horror at the void that I assumed was a face. Through all the terror that choked my psyche, my arm somehow found the will to lift my hand and point the blade of my small knife toward the intruder. Its immense pitch-black appendage shifted downward and tilted slightly, as if pondering the significance of my weapon. There, with a sudden, bone-snapping jerk, it lifted its featureless visage to meet my tear-stained face once more. The egregious thing seemed to examine me with amusement as its mangled arm kneaded softly at the wall of the room. My legs shook and my heart pounded so intensely, I thought I'd burst from my chest cavity. Although I held the knife in front of my shivering self, I had not the strength to otherwise move. The corner of the room became my entire world, my very life relying solely on the space that existed between myself and the anathema. My eyes peeled further wide as the entity engorged skull began to shape and contort. I watched in agonizing terror as the face's center stretched and tore disgustingly into a hole, like a lipless jaw trying to scream. The flaps of gore-ridden, inky skin separated just enough for red gums and yellowed teeth to faintly show through the tears. A guttural moan exhaled from the fissures in a tangle of high and low pitches, stealing the last ounce of my resolve. My quivering hands dropped the knife, and I fell with it to the floor with a painful thud. I let out a small sob as snot and other fluid dripped down from my face. The realization that I was going to die ripped my wrenching throat as a horrifying series of voices echoed through the many mouths of the abomination. It was like the thing was trying to form speech, but hadn't done so in centuries. Its form struggled and convulsed as grotesque belches and groans clawed their way violently out of its many orifices. Finally, after a torturous effort, the thing managed to weave the words, gnarled and disgusting from its awful face. Don't shut the door. It screeched in rage-filled, overlapping tones. Never again. Understand? My eyes focused on the monster with both increased horror and confusion, and I found myself nodding in acknowledgement. It kept that horrible form in an eyeless stare as if considering my response. Then, after a moment or so, it slowly slipped back beyond the door frame and out of sight. I sat there dumbfounded, the horror not yet entirely dissolved. Only a minute later I heard the front door open, soon followed by a shocked gasp. My partner ran into the room to see me, soaked in snot and tears, kneeling in the corner. The knife lay a foot or so in front of me, and they picked it up gingerly. They lowered themselves to my eye level and grabbed my shoulders, half hugging, half shaking me while imploring what had happened. A vacancy plastered my wet face as I simply told them, "Burglary." I don't really know why I lied to them. I guess I just knew they wouldn't believe me. I suppose I don't really expect anyone to. Needless to say, after the incident, I convinced my partner to move out of that place. After seeing the sight of the smashed-in bedroom door, it didn't take much to convince them. We spent the week rapidly moving everything out during the day and sleeping at my parents' house at night. They didn't mind us staying with them after hearing about what had happened. A few weeks later, we managed to find another apartment, though it wasn't as nice as our previous one. I was hoping to be able to let go of what happened in the old place. I just wanted to move on and forget about it. I honestly thought I had until last night. I got to bed shortly after my partner had fallen asleep. I looked at the empty entrance to our new bedroom, studying it for a moment. This had become routine in the weeks since everything happened. Thankfully, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. I rested my head on the soft pillow and began to doze off when a strange sensation came over me. Not wanting to acknowledge it, I tried to swallow it down and force myself to sleep. In time, however, my curiosity and concern got the better of me, and I opened my eyes just enough to peek between the lids, focusing on the doorway. There, peeking back at me from just around the frame, was a bulbous, dark head. It was the summer of 22. Me and Alice always had a summer ritual, if you will. Diving in the rabbit hole. For us locals, it wasn't anything steeped in logic. It was just something that happened dead of night on one hot summer day. 600 meters of crystal clear water that had claimed dozens of lives within a month. You could try to close the hole as much as you could, but come daybreak, it would open once more as if by an unseen force beneath the depths. It was dangerous, or so we've been told since we were kids. I was always the cautious one, never diving further than where the hole disappeared from view. Alice, though, was the adventurous type, going deeper and deeper than I could ever imagine. We were professional divers, but Rabbit's Hole had always been an enigma. I'd always be the first one waiting at the top, anxiously scanning the surface for any sign of her sandy blonde hair. She'd always come up eventually, always joking about the strange light that flickered in the deep blue, a light that seemed to taunt her, beckoning her to catch it. It was just play for her. I tried to warn Alice, afraid that it was some unseen creature waiting to consume her, but like always, she'd always wave my fears away, saying it was probably just a small fish. But that day in the summer of 2022 at the sunset in the horizon, I wasn't so sure. 5 minutes passed, then 10, and the silence continued. I was terrified, wondering what monster lurked in the depths, luring Alice over for its feast. She was my friend, and I had to believe she was still alive, so I slipped on my diving gear and dove back down. Luckily, I hadn't dove down too far, so there was a chance I could make it deep enough to see her. At that point, I wasn't thinking straight, too afraid for my friend's life to think about the monster that could have taken her. Down I went, not even caring as darkness consumed me. The only light I had coming from my own flashlight, and yet there was no sign of her. By that point, I only had enough air to dive back up, and so I resigned myself to her fate. But as I stepped wearily on the sandy shore of the beach, I found a familiar GoPro waiting for me. It had been Alice's. I would have shivered if I hadn't already been worn down from desperately looking in the depths. And then I took a look through the footage, and I could feel my whole body shake from fear. I could see my friend swimming blindly in the dark, following a faint light that seemed to be glowing in the distance. and in that footage I could hear a voice rasping in the distance. "Come," it had said. Alice seemed to almost be moving in a trance-like state, blindly following the strange voice. Deeper and deeper she went to a point where no human could go. It was unimaginable. I strained against the darkness, struggling to spot the creature responsible. But there was none, only a voice that sounded almost sugary sweet. And finally, there echoed the horrible thud of her body hitting the bottom of the hole. Alice said nothing, not even giving a final gasp for air. It was like this silence that has haunted me to this day. It was about mid-afternoon when I decided to take an impulsive walk through the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The smell of the pine in the air was refreshing as I pushed through the brush and stepped over rocks heading down the trail. The sounds of birds singing in the late summer afternoon and the crickets buzzing was a serene, safe feeling for me. It created a type of bubble I got trapped in, daydreaming about who knows what. I was so deep in the thoughts of my mind I hadn't even realized I had gone off of the trail. It was about 30 minutes before I had even realized I couldn't feel the soft sand of the riverbank beneath my feet. I didn't remember when direction I had exactly come from, so I stood silently for a minute listening to the birds chirp. I decided to follow the sound of the river, which sounded closer than it actually was. As I was walking, the sun had already begun to set. As I was walking back to the river, the smell began to linger in the air. It was like a thick copper smell, almost electrical. The more I walked, the stronger the smell got. At this point, it almost smelled like rotting meat with a side of gasoline. I had to cover my mouth with my shirt at times because it was so putrid. I decided to ignore the smell and keep walking. After about an hour of walking, I finally was back on the trail, and the sun was almost completely down. Just the tint of orange in the sky was the only light I had to see clearly around me. I was about 5 minutes from the mouth of the trail when I realized the forest around me was silent. The birds had stopped singing their sweet songs. The crickets along with cicadas had stopped buzzing, which isn't a very normal thing to happen, especially in the evening. The silence was so deafening I couldn't even process my own thoughts. Then the smell came back almost 6 times stronger than it had before. It was so strong this time I actually began to make me retch. All of a sudden, the strongest feeling of dread I have ever had crept up my spine, sending chills all along my body. I stopped to listen, just to maybe see if I could hear anything in the silence. Just as soon as I was about to keep going and ignore everything that happened, something or someone spoke. "Hey, hey you." The thing called out in an almost perfect voice of my own. I couldn't move. All I could do was stand there like a deer in headlights. I spun around to see where the voice came from. I was just about to begin running when I saw it. At the top of the hill to my left, there was a deer peeking around from behind a large oak tree. The deer caught my gaze, almost like it was intentionally trying to get me to look at it. I stared at the deer, and he stared right back. Right off the bat, I noticed something was extremely off with the deer. At first I hadn't realized, but its head was too far above the ground to be even remotely normal. The head was almost 8 feet off the ground. The eyes weren't even that of a deer. They were human-like and dark. As far as I could tell, they were black. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my life. The deer spoke to me. The same voice I had heard only moments ago was now coming from the deer. I wanted to throw up right where I stood, only I couldn't move. I was frozen there, eyes locked with what I thought only minutes ago was a normal deer. All of a sudden the deer stepped out from behind the tree. The only thing that even looked like a deer was its head. From the neck down, the thing was very pale and lanky. Its skin was wrapped tightly around the slim frame of the creature. I stood there petrified as the beast took a step towards me. That was enough to send me into action. I turned and ran faster than I ever have in my life. I ran even faster when the thing let out the most horrific scream I had ever heard and began to pursue me. I ran as fast as my legs could take me until I saw the parking lot of the trail and my car. I got in my car, slamming my key into the ignition. As my car roared to life, I threw it into drive and sped away from that place, not once looking back. Needless to say, I will never be walking in the woods alone again. Whenever I'm sitting in a park with nothing better to do, or on a subway ride that's 1 or 2 stops too long, I end up taking out my sketchbook and drawing people. It's always people that catch my attention. A big coat, headphones, interesting facial features, anything that I feel might be fun to put on paper. It's mainly for practice, but the people I draw sometimes notice, which can be a bit embarrassing if they ask me to stop. All the same, it's a good way to practice my art. Though something happened to me recently, and now I feel like I should stop. I was on a subway, a long, boring ride. You know, the kind where the doors only open every 5 minutes. I was traveling to visit my family, but they live a bit on the far side. So I did what I always did, and removed the pencil and sketchbook from my bag. The book isn't very large, but it's clear what I'm doing whenever I do use it. With the proper tools in hand, I scanned the crowd for someone distinctive. I found this distinctive someone in the form of an old, shriveled up lady, hunched over and reading a book. I liked her as a subject not only for the interesting features in the form of wrinkled flesh and sun-damaged skin spots, but the book she was reading looked ominous in a way I can't quite describe. Its indigo hardback with no distinctive features other than a golden eye decal was something that struck me. So I began letting my pencil dance down the page with light, messy lines. I wasn't going for anything too detailed after all. After about 10 minutes of this, I was mostly engrossed in my drawing, though when I looked back at her for reference, I saw she'd abandoned her book and was staring right at me. Her eyes bored into mine, instantly sending chills up my spine. Unblinking, unmoving. I let out a nervous laugh. "Sorry, ma'am. I just thought you were pretty, so I wanted to draw you." I smiled politely, sheepishly, but she gave no reply. She simply held that gaze of hers. Even as I broke eye contact, I could still feel her looking at me. "I can stop if you want." I tried, but to no avail. She was clearly upset, so I placed my supplies back into my bag. She didn't stop looking at me, but luckily my stop was the next one. When the doors opened, I said to her, "Have a good day," before hurrying out of the door with unease filling my stomach. I could feel her cold eyes on me, even as the subway doors shut. It was strange, I thought, but decided not to let one odd encounter ruin my day. When I finally reached my family and got settled, I told them about this encounter. Old folks do that sometimes. Maybe she was hard of hearing or something. My sister assured me with a light-hearted pat on my back. "Well, can I see your sketch of her?" I took out the book and handed it to her, allowing her to do the honors of looking for the page. "Wow, you got a lot done in 10 minutes. But I thought you said she was looking away from you." I did. Maybe she had the wrong page open? I peered over her shoulder and my stomach dropped. This wasn't my drawing. Instead of the messy, unfinished pencil sketch, it was a much more detailed drawing of her, with much darker strokes, what appeared to be charcoal. It was still the same old lady, but she was looking right at the viewer, and smiling a wide, unnerving grin. Without a warning to my sister, I tore the page out and threw it away in my bewildered panic. Have I made a mistake? I didn't mean to do anything wrong. I think I need help. When the body washed up, the same name was on everybody's mind. Bloated Bill. It was hard not to think that with the state the corpse was in. We get bodies like that every now and then up at Lake Alpo. Usually because some kid or a drunk bonked their head real hard and drowned in the water. Not this time though. This time, it was clear what had killed her. Rachel, I think her name was. Didn't see much of her before that day. She seemed nice and sure sounded that way from how folks talked about her. Shame to see her gone so suddenly. Worse was how it had happened. We saw the wounds that they had pulled her out. 2 massive gashes running down her chest and giving way to giant holes where her lungs had been. Her ribs were broken off in jagged ends, and her skin and clothes had been torn up something fierce. It was obvious from that it was no accident. Something had ripped open poor Rachel and tore out her lungs. Just like in the stories. You see, there's this old tale around Lake Alpo, that of Bloated Bill. Every kid in Grand Falls got told about him, usually around a crackling campfire one dark summer night. The story goes that before we had drones or underwater cameras, people still wanted to know what was at the bottom of Lake Alpo, and one man set out to do just that. He grabbed an old diving suit, the kind with a fishbowl for a helmet, and set out into the murky depths. He was down there all day until about midnight when the crew he'd left to pump air to his suit got a signal. 2 tugs on the safety line. Bill needed more air. So they start pumping faster now. But no matter how hard they try, old Bill keeps tugging on that line. I need air. I need air. A few minutes later, the line goes still, and the crew starts rushing to pull old Bill out of the water. 7 minutes later, his bloated corpse broke the surface, naked and swollen on lake water. Problem wasn't just that there was no sign of his suit, but the line, the tube feeding back into the lake, something was still pulling on it. 2 tugs. I need air. Nowadays, people say Bill is still trapped down there needing air, something fierce. And if you find yourself lingering too close to the lakefront, he'll rise from the water and steal the breath right from your lungs. Didn't take a genius to make the connection. It was more gruesome than we'd imagined, but we figured Bill just had some trouble getting the air out, so we took the whole lungs instead. Authorities tried to calm us down, but good luck calming an entire town after someone washes up with their guts ripped out. Even those who weren't whispering about Bloated Bill were starting to panic. To make matters worse, poor Rachel wasn't alone. A week later, another body was found at the edge of the lake. Thomas Lorne was his name. He was 10. Same MO too. His lungs were ripped out, leaving 2 gaping holes in his tiny chest. That got folks real riled up. Rachel was one thing, but now another body, and a child to no less. That was unacceptable. People started demanding the police do something with much greater fervor. Someone even graffitied a cruiser. But the police couldn't do much. There were no fingerprints left on the bodies, no bloodstains, not their own. Not even a trace of the lungs. Only thing they had in common was where they were last seen. Lake Alpo. Of course, they're not going to find anything. I remember someone saying one night. We'd all gathered in the town pub to drink down our worries. Not that it worked, though. I don't know about everyone else, but I was feeling antsy sitting there with my thumb up my ass. You can't arrest a demon, that same person said. His voice was like gravel, but his words were exactly what I wanted to hear. And this be a demon, you'll know it. It's Bloated Bill out there, and he's come for us all. The fuck the cops think they can do? The hell you expect us to do about it? Someone else said, but no one was having it. I don't know about you, but I'm not waiting here like some baby for Bill to come to take someone else. This is our town, damn it. If he wants it, well, then he's gonna have to go through us. And you think we're gonna do more than the cops? Ain't nothing on God's green earth that can't survive my 12 gauge. Nothing, you hear? I don't care if it's a ghost, a demon, or some psychopath out there. I'll blow it clean back to hell. A flurry of yes rose up from the crowd, and I was right there with them. So I say we go down to the lake ourselves and wait for that son of a bitch to come crawling on out. Then we give it a taste of good old-fashioned Grand Falls justice. Ya hear? A roar surged through the room. Us all being liquored up like we were, there was nothing he could say that we'd object to. So we all stumbled on back to our homes, grabbed our pieces, and marched on Lake Alpo like a conquering army. In hindsight, it wasn't the brightest idea. Even without the talk of demons and such, you never want 24 drunk, armed assholes all in the same place. Something was gonna happen, and it wasn't gonna be pretty. But none of us could have predicted what came next. Our plan was the half-baked stepchild of booze and bloodlust. We just squatted down in some bushes by the lake and waited. Sure, we sent some poor boy out to sit right at the water's edge, but he wasn't so much bait as a lightweight readying to take a piss in the lake. Most of the night was quiet, which was something, given how much lead and liquor there was between us. Occasionally something stirred in the water, only to end up being a trout or mosquito. It wasn't until around midnight that something finally started to happen. I was half asleep when the guy squatting next to me shook me awake. What's happening? Did we get him? I asked only for my compatriot to raise a hand to his lips and then point to the lake. Peering between the bush branches, I saw something passing through the lake. It's hard to describe what with the beer goggles I had on, but the best I can call it is a shadow. A real weird one though. You ever look at a white wall and notice one spot whiter than the rest? It was sort of like that. In the black water of the lake, it stood out for being darker than all the shadows. Your eyes couldn't quite focus on it either. The edges all blurred together as if they were trying to melt into the shadowy waters. But those dark depths were too bright for it. It drifted to the waterfront at a snail's pace. From that, I knew it wasn't no ghost. That thing had some weight keeping it chained to the lake floor. Didn't change the fact I still had no idea what I was seeing. None of us did. Even drunk as sailors like we were, no one thought to fire at the shadow. Curiosity, infusion, and a thimble of fear kept our eyes alone, aimed at the water. Eventually it drifted into the shallows and started rising from the water. First thing I saw was that fishbowl stuck to its head. The iron was rusted dark and covered in green gunk that I'd grown into its crevices. The window glass, however, was in remarkably fine shape. You couldn't find a single crack on any of them, and inside, you'd make out the dark water kept trapped inside the suit. As it rose, you could make out more and more of the suit, and while it was old as dirt, it was in real good shape, all things considered. Even the air tube was in perfect condition as it stretched back into the murky depths. The suit rising from the lake wasn't something any of us expected to see. Fear worked its way down to us, even in the depths of our stupor. And we were all frozen to our various spots. I, for one, wasn't entirely sure I wasn't hallucinating until I saw someone else's reaction. Even though I couldn't do much, when you see something impossible, everything you think of starts sounding stupid. I only knew that I didn't want that thing to notice me, and if that meant hiding in the bush like a baby, so be it. A mindset I'm pretty sure was shared, with only one exception. Ha! The boy we sent out as bait as the suit trudged towards him through the water. Now that there's funny. Where'd you guys even get a whatever suit? A laugh followed quickly after his words, but nothing motivated him to move. I wish I could say I wanted to scream at the boy to move. In actuality, I was glad the diver took a liking to the poor fool. Better him than me, was my thought. The diver stopped when it was standing right in front of the boy. He was still laughing his stupid little head off and gave no struggle against what happened next. The diver reached behind it and drew a strange-looking knife made from a strange metal I'd never seen before. It had been poorly carved, giving it jagged edges and vaguely curved back like the hook of a fang or canine. The face was black too, but leagues more so than obsidian and the sort. When you looked right at it, the blade's features vanished into its dark face. It almost didn't look like a blade, but rather a chunk of the night sky someone had cut out and shaped. Weird as that blade was, it didn't seem to knock the boy back to his senses. He just kept laughing and laughing, even as the diver raised the knife high over its head and drove it down into its heart. It wasn't quite what I imagined it would be. In movies, you see blood fly everywhere, and someone making all these garbled sounds when they get stabbed. But not that boy. His whole body went rigid as the knife went in, but that was about it. A moment later, he slumped against the shoreline and just stopped moving. Nothing more. It was honestly chilling. The diver wasn't finished with him, though. It carved its way through the poor kid until it had cut open 2 massive holes in his chest and rib cage. It flung all the shards of bones over his shoulder and into the like scrap, not worth a second thought. It wasn't until it had a perfect view of the boy's lungs that it finally stopped. Reupholstering the blade, it slowly lifted them from the chest, handling them carefully like they were newborn babies. That alone would have been more than enough to scar my memory. But it was forgotten after what happened next. The diver reached up and began unscrewing its helmet. Water guzzled out of the edges and came exploding out when the diver removed the bowl. Not sure what I was expecting, but it was at least something human. Maybe a zombie. Like Bloated Bill, with pale, all cheeks puffed out, and eyes shriveled like raisins. Instead, I saw a true monster. I don't want to say it was like a fish. It had sickly scales, fins, and even those dead, glassy eyes like one. But there was something wrong about it. And it wasn't just that it was wearing a diving suit. The face looked like an ill-fitting mask, as if it didn't sit right on the bones. I think it was too small or something. Yeah, that was it. The face was too small and gruesomely stretched over its skull. Any moment now, it would break and tear open, I swore. That wasn't what stopped it, though. Seconds after it took the helmet off, its gills started flaring and gasping for water. I heard what sounded like gasps come from it as its eyes bulged in desperation. Part of me hoped it would suffocate then and there, but it seemed ready for that. It raised the lungs over its head and opened its jaw wider than I thought was possible. Rows of needle-like teeth glistened in the moonlight for a second before flattening themselves against pale gums. It then dropped the lungs into its massive maw and swallowed them in one bite. I saw them bulge through the skin of its neck before disappearing into the suit. Even then, I could see something moving, rearranging in its chest as water within. The creature seemed to be struggling at first, looking like it got something caught in its throat before the churning within it stopped. Then the creature took a long, deep breath. Finally, came a mangled voice from somewhere in its gullet. Air. Not sure why that did it for me, and not seeing that thing rip out a man's lungs. Yes, a part of me thought that, despite everything, that thing couldn't stay up here for long. I even saw it choking on the air. I figured it'd have to go back to the depths and took comfort in that idea. Never would have guessed how wrong I was. I'm pretty sure I fired first. Can't be certain though, because the rain of bullets that came was pure chaos. The forest ignited as every last man opened fire with everything they had. Iron shredded the water's surface, and that thing was far tougher. Bullets simply bounced off its scales like they were Tic Tacs. I don't think it even knew we were shooting at it at one point because, for a split second, all it did was stand there staring. It was curious, I think. like a child with a new toy. Toy that breathed. If it wasn't for the lungs, I'm not sure what would have happened. Whatever that creature did, I don't think it had perfected such yet. It sucked in a few more breaths of air before it suddenly gagged. One wet breath followed another before blood began spewing from its mouth. The creature lurched forward as it violently hacked up the lungs. They splattered across the ground in a shredded mess, full of holes and torn ends. Seconds later, the creature started to gag once again. I smiled, but not for long. Even as it choked, the creature snatched up the shredded lungs and helmet before diving back into the lake. I watched its figure dissolve back into the great shadow before disappearing into the murky depths of Lake Alpo. We fired long after it was gone, and only stopped when our clips ran dry. The silence that followed was the worst I'd ever heard. All eyes were on that boy, or what was left of him. No one knew who he was. That was the worst part. We got him killed and didn't even know his name. Couldn't bear to drag him back like that. So we all just stayed there until the booze pulled us into sleep. Not me, though. I couldn't take my eyes off the lake. A hiker found us in the morning and ran screaming for the hills. I don't blame him. If I stumbled across a group of drunks surrounding a body with its lungs scooped out, I'd race like a bat from hell too. Cops came not long after that and detained the lot of us, though we were let go in the end. Not a lot of evidence we did the deed apart from us just being there. Our stories, though, kept us there for longer than we'd have liked. Many of the boys had been sober enough to remember the whole thing and blabbed about it all over the jail cells. Smart ones, me included, knew better than to talk about monsters to cops. Official story was that we went down to the lake to find Bloated Bill, only to pass out. The real killer then snuck up and butchered the poor boy while we were asleep. It didn't reflect the best on us, which was fair, all things considered. The killing stopped for a while. I tried to find some pride in that, but I know it wasn't because of us. Things stayed that way for some time until about a week ago. Her name was Josephine Peterson. She had kids. They begged to look at their mother, but we wouldn't let them. Seeing their mother like that, guts pulled out a slaughtered mule. It wouldn't have done nobody any good. That wasn't even the worst part. You see, Josephine was a smart woman, and she'd stopped going near the lake the second they found the first body. She'd instead taken to the bar to occupy herself. That's where they found her, some 10 miles from the lake. I don't know a lot right now. Can't say what that thing was, how it did what it did, or what it even wants. Nothing kills for air alone. Whatever reason it's doing all this for, I don't care to find out. I'll be moving out within the week. My sister has a place I should be able to hunker down in. It's right in the middle of Arizona, too. Miles and miles from any lakes, streams, or even puddles. Will it do any good? More so than if I stayed, waiting for that thing to come for me. I might not know much, but I do know this. There's no ghosts in Lake Alpo. Instead, there is something much, much worse. How much longer, Mommy? Elizabeth asked her mother. My wife turned around in her seat. Not too much longer, honey. Try to go back to sleep, Liv told her. I can't, Mommy. I'm too dizzy, Elizabeth told her. Honey, pull over when you see an opportunity. We've been in the car for 2 days, Liv told me. She was sure to use her polite, loving tone, but it did little to conceal the icy daggers she had been staring into me for the last 3 days. It's about lunchtime anyway. I'll stop at the next diner I see. Yay! Elizabeth exclaimed weakly from her booster seat. We had eaten every breakfast, lunch, and dinner at roadside diners for the last 2 days. The novelty was wearing off for me. But for a 4-year-old, every stop was an adventure. She hadn't done much but sleep and vomit for the entire trip, but the diners made her smile, watching her light up with excitement when she talked to the waitresses at each one. She would scan the walls of each small-town restaurant, each with a different theme of old tin signs or paintings, even old newspaper clippings from old papers. I must have acquired a dozen stuffed animals from various claw machines. Liv was irritated at the frivolous expense, but said nothing because we both enjoyed the amusement it provided Elizabeth. Even a little smile on her face was all we could hope for these days. Just a tiny break for all of us from the 2 years of pain, vomiting, and tears that had been cursed with. As a parent, seeing your child in pain gives you a sense of agony, but knowing your child is going to die and there is nothing you can do gives you a deep, profound sense of failure and emptiness. That feeling has stricken Liv in me. I have felt guilty for the last 6 months. This deep pain that we have both felt, the stress of cross-country trips to see specialists, the disappointment each time we returned home with no help from anyone, and the impending doom of staring down complete financial ruin with the stacks of medical bills. I knew on some level that somehow there had been some way for Liv and me to share this burden, to be stronger for facing it together, but I had shut her out somehow, and likewise, she had shut me out. "Daddy, can I have ice cream for dinner?" Elizabeth asked. I glanced up to the rearview mirror to see her smile. Her eyes met mine in the mirror. "You can have anything you want, honey," I told her. "No," Liv said firmly. "You have been eating junk food for the last 2 days. The doctors say you need to eat more vegetables. They'll make you better," Liv said. Elizabeth groaned in disappointment and Liv sighed. She hated being the bad guy, always trying to enforce the doctor's orders, even when she knew substituting broccoli for chocolate ice cream wasn't likely to give us another day with our baby. I pulled off the highway in a town Google didn't bother to name. Kelly's Diner was hand-painted on a sign over a little truck stop restaurant. We walked in the door and were greeted by an older blonde waitress. "Y'all sit wherever you like." Except for a couple of truckers eating at the bar, the place was empty. Liv went over and took a seat at the booth. Elizabeth and I watched as her mother took a leather bag from her purse. Liv began removing bottles of prescription pills from the bag and lining them up on the table. Elizabeth looked up at me with a frown. "I hate taking those pills every time we eat. They make me sick, Daddy," she groaned. "I know, honey, but they're going to make you better. And soon you won't have to take them anymore," I told her. She wasn't looking up at me anymore. Her attention had drifted off towards something behind me. I turned to see what she was looking at. In the corner at the entrance to the hall leading toward the restrooms was a claw machine full of stuffed animals. I looked back down to see Elizabeth giving me her big puppy dog eyes. I looked back toward the table to see that Liv was still lining up bottles. "Okay, but only one try," I told her. And sat down at the table just as the waitress arrived with glasses of water for each of us. "Looks like we have a winner," the waitress said to Elizabeth with a kind smile. Elizabeth held up her stuffed alligator over her head like a trophy. "Look, alligator!" she yelled excitedly to our waitress. "Great, another toy," Liv said. "Put it down for now. It's time to take your medicines, honey." My daughter tucked the alligator next to her booster seat and removed her baseball cap from her head. As she removed her head, I watched our waitress's smile turn into a thin grimace. She stared at her for a minute, and as if she was suddenly aware of my wife and I watching her, she offered us both a look of pity and cleared her throat. Then she began to read us the daily specials. "I'll have a cheeseburger and fries," I told her, glancing at her name tag, Kelly. "All of the same," Liv said. "Mac and cheese," Elizabeth said, pointing at the picture of her kids' menu. "Honey, why don't you—" Liv started and stopped. "Can we get a side of broccoli with that?" she asked Kelly, unable to deprive her daughter of yet another treat. Kelly went to the back and hung our order up for the cook. Elizabeth took her glass of water and began to swallow her pills one at a time. She didn't fuss or complain once. In a weird way, that saddened me. She had become so accustomed to taking her poison that she didn't even complain anymore. I spotted Kelly sneaking glances as she bussed tables across the restaurant. We ate our meal, and with little conversation except for the 20 questions about each knick-knack within eyesight of Elizabeth. She had become so inquisitive lately, as if she sensed the gravity of her illness and wanted to learn as much about the world as she could while she had time. "Mommy, I have to go to the bathroom," she said. Liv stood and took her back to the restroom. Kelly came and handed me the check. I pulled my wallet out and fumbled through credit cards. "I didn't mean to stare," Kelly said apologetically. "It's okay. She's used to it by now," I said. When people see a person with no hair, no eyebrows, and sunken eyes, they know what it means. I lost my husband to cancer a few years back, but a child. I'm so sorry. Kelly added. I said nothing. She took my card and the check and went back to her kiosk. Liv and Elizabeth returned shortly and Kelly brought my card back. "I'm sorry, sir. Your card was declined," Kelly told me. The tone of pity she had previously now 2 notches deeper. I pulled my wallet out and began to pull another credit card out. "No, that's fine. It's on the house," I began to protest. "Free meals for anyone who wins alligators from the claw game. It's a very strict policy," Kelly said and winked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth giggled and, as if she had forgotten all about it, then picked up her alligator and held it back up with a roar. An hour down the road, Elizabeth was sound asleep. I thought you had caught up on the credit card debts," Liv said quietly in an icy tone. "I did. I canceled each one as I paid them off. I guess I just mixed them up," I said. She nodded, not taking her eyes off the road. She knew I was lying. "Welcome to Oak Hill, population 312. The sign read as we pulled into town. I'll have to come out here with some paint tomorrow and change that to 315. I told Liv. She ignored me. 10 minutes later, we pulled off the paved road and up a steep driveway. "This will be great in the winter," Liv said. When we pulled up to the house, though, her eyes widened. It was huge. Even I was surprised. I had only seen pictures on the website, but they didn't do it justice. Smith Manor could more easily pass for a hotel than a house. "Oh my god," Liv mumbled as she stepped out of the car. It was built at the top of a hill, so in each direction, we could see trees for miles and miles, and the house was enormous. The paint was dark green with white trim. The realtor said the key would be under the mat. "If you unlock the door, I'll get Elizabeth." Liv nodded and began to head toward the house. I opened the back door and unbuckled the car seat. I did my best to make sure I didn't wake her as I pulled her out of the car and carried her up to the house. Honestly, I knew there was very little chance I would wake her. The medication made her so tired. The inside of the house was even more impressive. The foyer had a 15-foot ceiling that had a large crystal chandelier hanging in the middle. 2 staircases mirrored each other as they led up to the left and right sides of the second floor. I looked to my right and saw a room that appeared to be lined with bookshelves. To my left, I was in a room with a couch in it. I laid Elizabeth on the couch and set off to find Liv. I went back across the foyer to the other room I had to see. There was a large old oak desk and leather-bound books stacked on top of it. There were hundreds of other books on the shelves. I left the room and walked down the hallway into a very large kitchen. I didn't see Liv in there either. Something called to me from further down the hall. It called softly and solemnly in an invisible voice. I walked down the hallway and found a door. It had a latch on it. There was a place to put a padlock, but At the moment, there wasn't one. I opened the door. There was a long row of wooden stairs that led down into what I imagined was the basement. It was dark and eerily silent. "Liv?" I called out. "Is there anyone down there?" I didn't hear a response. And for a long while, I just stood there and stared into the darkness. And the darkness stared back. "You were right," Liv said from the kitchen. Her voice startled me. I slammed the door shut. "This house is amazing. It's the perfect place for us to just relax and enjoy our time with Elizabeth," Liv told me. I said nothing. I just held my wife for a minute. The smell of her shampoo filled my nostrils. It brought back a flood of memories. Couldn't remember the last time I had been so close to my wife. "I'm sorry about everything. I was pissed about the move. And the way you went about it was all wrong. We have been under so much stress with everything," Liv told me. "I know I should have talked to you before I sold our house. And I know I shouldn't have quit my job. We really couldn't afford it. And even if my family owns this house, I knew at the time if I would have come home and told you this was my plan, you would have freaked out. You would have thought I lost my mind." Liv gently placed one finger over my mouth. "Shh." I was mad. "And I have no idea what we will do when we run out of money. And there is no way we can afford the mortgage on this house. But you were right. We have seen a dozen doctors and tried every treatment offered. And still, the most optimistic medical opinion is 3 to 6 months. We will settle in here and make the most of our time as a family. We will do everything we can to keep her comfortable and as happy as we can. And when it's done, we will figure out the finances." I just held her. I held her tight. I was happy that she had started to come around. I knew she didn't know exactly what she was really in for, but in the end, she would know that this was the right thing to do for all of us. "Why don't you pick out a room for Elizabeth?" The realtor said the entire house was left completely furnished. "I'll get started on dinner. We have a box of snacks and ramen in the trunk. I figured that would work for tonight. Tomorrow we can go to town, check things out, and pick up some groceries. The movers will be here day after tomorrow." Liv kissed me and held me again. "I love you," she said softly into my ear. And for the first time in a year, I knew she meant it. I went out to the car. It was dark now and cold, much colder than I had expected for spring. I pulled the key fob out of my pocket and unlocked the car. The wind howled through the woods. As I lifted the box of snacks out the trunk, I froze. The wind had been howling with 1,000 voices as it passed through the trees, but for a second, I could swear I heard one of those voices yell, "Leave now." I stood straight up and looked out into the woods. There was a faint glimmer of moonlight off the river that I hadn't noticed earlier, but I couldn't see anyone. I looked back to the house. It felt somehow larger now, stronger, with the lit up against the night. Elizabeth woke up just as I started filling bowls with ramen noodles. We ate our first meal in the house in the dining room, sitting around a table much too large for us. There were 15 chairs at the table. We ate quietly. The room was dimly lit with 2 chandeliers hanging over the table. As large as they looked, they did little to drive the darkness from the room. "Well, Elizabeth, what do you think of the house?" Liv asked. I waited patiently for a long string of questions from Elizabeth as she finished her soup, but instead, without looking up, she just shrugged. "It feels dark, Mommy." Liv and I exchanged disappointed glances. "Well, tomorrow night we will light a fire, and maybe the candles too," I said, pointing at the large fireplace on the wall. "This place was built by my great-great-grandparents a very long time ago, and back then they didn't have electricity. There are several fireplaces, and the walls are lined with candles and oil lamps. That's what they used to use at night." Elizabeth finished slurping her soup and then stumbled slightly in her chair. I don't feel good. I think I just want to go to bed, she told us. Of course, honey. It's been a long trip. We could all use some rest. I awoke in the middle of the night. I heard voices in the darkness. I got out of bed and slowly crept towards the hallway. In the moonlight that streaked across the floor, I could see Elizabeth standing there. She giggled and played with her stuffed animals. I just stood there for a moment and watched her play. She hadn't had too many opportunities to play as a child should. Liv placed her hand on my shoulder, startling me. I jumped a little, but was careful not to make a noise. I didn't want to interrupt my daughter playing. She looks happy. I haven't seen her smile this much since she got sick, Liv whispered to me. Should we put her back to bed? She asked me. No, she knows where we are if she needs us. Let's just let her play and get to know the house. Elizabeth took one of her Hot Wheels and rolled it down the hallway. It made little clicks as it rolled over the floorboards, and a clunk as it hit the wall and came to a stop in the dark corner of the hallway. Okay, let's go to bed then, Liv said. She walked away and crawled back into bed. My heart skipped a beat as the Hot Wheel rolled back from the darkness to land at my daughter's feet. Elizabeth giggled and I went back to bed. The next morning, we had a breakfast that consisted of muffins, chips, and honey buns. Leftover snacks were acquired from truck stops and gas stations along the way. A meal that Liv would hardly have approved of a couple of days ago, but much to my surprise, she didn't complain at all. How was your first night in the new house? Liv asked Elizabeth. It was great. At first, I was scared, but then I met my friends. They're nice. Elizabeth answered and took another bite of her chips. Liv looked at me quizzically. Your friends, honey? Elizabeth chomped another chip and nodded matter-of-factly. How about you run upstairs and get dressed, and then we will go to town and get groceries? Liv said. Okay, Mommy. Can we get ice cream? Maybe, Liv said. Once we heard the pitter-patter of Elizabeth's footsteps running up the stairs, Liv shook her head. What friends? Who is she talking about? It's been a long time since she had anyone to play with. I'm not surprised that she has imaginary friends, I said. She has never had imaginary friends before. What if she is hallucinating again? Liv asked. Tears began to well in her eyes. Last time was different. She wasn't playing with people. She was in a hospital bed and the doctors said it was a side effect of the drugs they had her on. Look, Liv, it's a big house and she has a great imagination. I don't think there is anything for us to worry about. Liv started to say something, but was silent by the sound of little footsteps charging down the stairs. Okay, Mommy, let's go. Let's go, let's go. Elizabeth said as she rushed to the door. The trip to town was about 20 minutes. It wasn't town as much as it was a street with a grocery store, a post office, and a doctor's office all between two gas stations. We walked the aisles, grabbing the basic grocery items we needed. Elizabeth sat in the cart. I knew she was a little too old to ride in the cart, but I knew walking the store would take too much out of her. Can we get tea, Mommy? Elizabeth asked. Tea? Why do you want tea? Liv asked. For Tiffany, Earl Grey. It's her favorite. Elizabeth explained. Liv shot me a concerned look. I saw that Elizabeth had noticed the concerned look and gone quiet. Something she had unfortunately seen too many times. And had come to associate with being sick and us traveling to a new city and seeing new doctors. You know what? I think I saw tea on that last aisle, I said, and gave Elizabeth my best smile. You want to go look? Elizabeth smiled back and nodded excitedly. As we checked out, the clerk scanned the items and chuckled. I figured you guys were passing through on a road trip. Never seen you in here before. Guess I was wrong. It'd be pretty hard to cook frozen pizzas on the road. No, we just moved here. Liv's son. Oh, what brought you to our little corner of the world? He asked. Liv sighed, obviously not wanting to tell the whole story. We needed a break from the city, and my husband's family had an old house here. It's been on the market for years and hasn't sold, so they are letting us stay there for a while. Is that right? The clerk asked as he continued scanning groceries. I can't blame you for getting out of the city, but where's the house? I don't think I've seen a for sale sign here my entire life. It's the Smith Manor. The clerk stopped scanning. Oh, I see, he said. The clerk gave me a hard look up and down, and then looked cautiously at my daughter. I cleared my throat. He began scanning groceries again. What's wrong with Smith Manor? Liv asked. The cashier looked at me, and I gave him a keep your mouth shut look. Just old rumors, the clerk said. I thought that was the end of it, but then the bagger, a heavy-set woman in her 50s, said, Oh, it's the old cult story. What cult? My wife asked, turning her attention to the bagger. Years ago, even before I was born, there was a cult up there. Supposedly they practiced some sort of old Phoenician rituals. And the story goes that children started going missing. Then one day, the townspeople went up there and found proof that the Smith family was sacrificing children to some old god. The townspeople killed the Smith family, and that house has been vacant on and off my whole life. Now and then, someone comes out and fixes the house up, but I can't say I've ever seen anyone live there. It's just an old urban legend, I said, cutting her off. I looked my wife in the eyes. An old legend carried on by people that have nothing better to do than gossip and defame my family. I looked back at the beggar, and she put her head down and quietly finished filling my cart with groceries. It was a long ride back to the house, and I thought about what I could say to comfort my wife when she brought up the story, but the words escaped me. We brought the groceries inside and put them away. Can I have my tea, Daddy? Elizabeth asked. I made a cup of tea, checked to make sure it wasn't too hot, and handed it to her. 2 cups, Daddy. 1 for me and 1 for Tiffany. Liv glared at me. I poured another cup and handed it to her. We both watched as Elizabeth walked as carefully as she could out of the kitchen, spilling a little with each step. I smirked at this and looked back to see Liv staring at me. Her icy tone had returned. What the fuck? She asked. I don't think a couple of cups of tea will hurt her, I said defensively. I'm not worried about the tea. I'm worried about the fact that you brought us here. I'm worried about what happened here. You never told me about any of this. Liv yelled at me as quietly as she could. I've heard the rumors. My grandparents told me about them years ago. According to them, that's why they left town after having lived here for 5 generations. I don't know exactly what happened, but they said rumors started, and before long it had become unbearable to live in a small town with such a horrible reputation. Honestly, if it was true, my grandparents would be in prison, right? I asked. Liv sighed. Yeah, I mean, yes, I guess so. It's a small backwoods town. Half of the people here never made it to high school. I wouldn't put much stock into what they say. And besides, the house is amazing. You said so yourself. And most importantly, Elizabeth loves it here. She's happy here, I pleaded. Liv sighed again. She looked out the window at the view over the valley. I moved closer to her. I placed my hands on her shoulders. We can't go back. The house sold quicker than I expected, and I don't have a job to go back to anyways. There isn't anything waiting for us there but a mountain of debt. When I reached out to my grandparents and told them the situation, they agreed to let us stay here for free as long as we want. We talked about this. Liv began to cry. I wiped a tear from her cheek. We have tried everything. We agreed we could take the money from the sale of our home, come out here and spend as much time as we can with Elizabeth, I said softly. Liv began to cry harder. I wrapped my arms around her and held her tight. She nodded yes into my shoulder. Yes, we'll stay here as long as we can. Elizabeth is happy here. We can stay. She squeezed me tightly. Behind her, I could see the door to the basement open slightly. The darkness called to me. Liv made a frozen pizza for dinner. We waited until it was about 7:30 to start cooking to let Elizabeth rest. She had been sleeping for several hours now. We could hear her running back and forth, playing in the hallway upstairs. When we called Elizabeth down to eat, she didn't reply. Worried, we both walked to the bottom of the stairwell. It was dark up there. The hallway she had been running in just seconds ago was pitch black. Liv and I both walked up the side of the stairs side by side. We reached the top of the stairs and turned into the hallway. It was pitch black, with just a thin line of moonlight streaming across the far end of the hall. It led in from one of the guest bedrooms. Elizabeth stepped out of the room and turned towards us. Liv and I both let out a breath of relief, and then after a second look, I realized that the little girl wasn't Elizabeth. My daughter was much thinner and bald, but this girl had long blonde hair and was wearing a dress I had never seen. An old dress that looked like something a girl would have worn 100 years ago. I turned to my wife, who was breathing heavily. Her eyes locked on the stranger at the end of the hallway. I was even more worried now that I knew I wasn't the only one seeing this. I looked back to see the girl was staring straight at us. She had one hand raised over her head. It was as if she were trying to wave but had forgotten how. And when we heard Elizabeth talking in her room, I looked at the room to our right. It was halfway between us and the little girl at the end of the hall. I began to run toward the door. Liv right behind me. The little girl lowered her hand and watched us without moving. When we entered the room, I flipped the light switch on. I caught a glimpse of at least a dozen more little girls in the room with my daughter, and in a flash, they disappeared, leaving only a trail of smoke where each one had stood. It looked like a dozen small campfires had been extinguished all at once. A thick smell of smoke filled my nostrils. I rushed in and picked up my daughter, holding her as close as I could. Daddy, that hurts. I loosened my grip only slightly. I shot panicked glances at every corner of the room. Liv stood next to us and placed her hand on Elizabeth's head. She looked around the hall and then looked at her in the eyes. Honey, who were those girls? She asked Elizabeth. Those are my friends. They told me they want me to stay with them forever. That you and Daddy had brought me here to be with them, Elizabeth said. Liv took Elizabeth from my arms. I went to the hall and looked left and right. Not a sign of them there. Honey, did they hurt you? Liv asked. No, Mommy. They are nice. Tiffany is my favorite. She likes to play tea parties. She says that Marty will come tonight and make it so I can stay here forever and ever, Elizabeth said. She had a happy, upbeat tone that I found particularly discomforting at this particular moment. Who's Marty? I asked Elizabeth. I don't know, Daddy, she answered. You're sleeping with us tonight, Elizabeth, Liv said. I woke up about 3 in the morning alone in bed. The lights were on, just the way we left them. I hadn't slept with the lights on since I was a little kid, but I had never seen a ghost either. I got up and walked downstairs. I could see a light on in the office near the foyer. I crept down slowly, scanning the room for my family, or those girls. As I approached the office door, I saw Liv at the desk. She was reading through an old leather journal. She looked up as I entered. Look at this, she commanded. I walked over slowly. She seemed frantic and jittery as she turned the journal toward me. There was a sketch of a man with a bull's head. I looked closer and saw that it was some kind of statue made of wooden sticks. Where's Elizabeth? I asked. Liv didn't answer me. She just picked up the journal and pointed at it. They figured it out. Your great-grandparents traveled the world studying old religions. They found out why the Phoenicians sacrificed children. It says that their cult recreated the rituals here in this house and sacrificed children to Marduk, but it didn't kill them. The souls stayed here in this house. Liv continued to ramble. I could tell she was having some kind of psychotic break. I tried to raise my voice and speak over her. Liv, where is Elizabeth? She continued talking and pointing at the journal and books she had open on the desk. Everything seemed muted. I could see her lips moving, but everything sounded like I was underwater. I felt my heart beating against my ribs as if it were trying to escape. And when I saw the same bull-headed statue in a picture in one of the open books, it was on fire. And when I looked closer, I saw something unthinkable. There was a child in his outstretched arms. Liv slapped my shoulder to get my attention and snapped me out of my fog. I heard the first thing I heard her say in 10 minutes. Don't you get it? Elizabeth said Marty was coming to see her tonight. Marty is Marduk, she yelled. I looked back at the picture of the wooden bull on the page. I looked at the agony on the face of the child in the flames. Over my dead body, I thought to myself. I ran out of the room and into the dining room. I froze with terror as I saw the table. The dozen ghost girls all sat at the table and turned their heads toward me in unison. It's almost time. He will be here any minute, and we can all be together. They said at the same time in an eerie cacophony that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I forced myself to look at every kid at the table. None of them were Elizabeth. I still had time. I had to find my daughter and get her out of here before it was too late. I ran out of the room and it hit me. I knew where my baby was. She was in the darkness, in the basement. I ran as fast as I could through the kitchen. The door to the basement was open. I stood at the top of the steps and saw lights flickering across the floor. I rushed down the steps, wood creaking beneath my feet. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. A giant fireplace at least 15 feet high and 10 feet across. There were torches lit at each side, and there in the center, to my horror, was a 10-foot statue of a man with a bull's head. Sections of tree limbs or small trees made up the body, while bundles of smaller sticks formed his head and arms. And there in his arms was Elizabeth. She was asleep or unconscious, and her wrists were tied to one arm, and her ankles at the other arm of the statue. I began to run to untie her when I was hit. I heard the clank of the shovel against my head before I felt it. I landed on my face on the concrete floor. I rolled over and saw Liv standing there with the shovel. You'll see in the morning. I know this is why we are here now. We can finally save our daughter and we can be together forever. You'll understand, she said. She hit me in the head again, and then again. I began to black out. Last thing I heard before I passed out was my wife saying, all of us, together forever. It's been almost a year now, and I still sit down to dinner every night with my daughter and the other souls trapped in this house. Liv is one of them. I didn't realize her plan, but she sacrificed herself as well. I will be joining them after I post this, and we will be together forever. I started a job at a canned vegetable company last month. It has been an easy, boring job, at least up until yesterday, that is. On day one, I was shown around the factory. My supervisor gave me a walkthrough of the entire factory. I saw each department and was given a brief description of what they do there. At the end of the day, I was told to come back the next day at 8 a.m. I was going to start in the boxing department, the last step in the factory. All I had to do was pull each case of canned goods off the conveyor belt, ensure it was sealed, and place it on a pallet. Sounded easy enough. What about that room over there? I asked, pointing to a room with fogged windows. I could see conveyor belts going into it and nothing coming out of it. But, unlike the rest of the facility, it was closed off. All the windows were fogged, so you couldn't see inside. My boss sighed and gave me a look that told me he was tired of people asking about that room. That room is off limits. Only restricted personnel are allowed in there. The next morning, I started my shift. About an hour into my shift, I was bored out of my mind. A box came down the conveyor belt, and I sealed it and stacked it on a pallet. Another box, sealed it, pallet, and did a break. I waved at my supervisor and told him I needed a bathroom break. He checked his watch and shook his head. Already? He asked in a frustrated tone. I'm sorry, nature calls, I replied. He stepped over to my conveyor belt. I'll cover you until you get back. Just try to be quick, he snapped. I walked to the bathroom and turned to make sure I was out of his line of sight. I was. I didn't have to use the bathroom and stood in front of the bathroom for a second. That's when I heard the noises. I heard horrible retching noises like someone was throwing up. But the noises weren't coming from the restroom. They were coming from the room with the fogged windows. I began to creep closer. The noises were becoming louder. When I reached the door, I cupped my hands over the glass to try to look inside. Something had to have seen me and the door opened. I almost fell over backward, but I was able to recover. A middle-aged man wearing the same uniform I had been given stood there staring at me. You must be Brett, the new guy. You were supposed to be in here an hour ago, he said. The wrenching sound was even louder now with the door open. I could hear the other people talking inside the room. I wasn't Brent, but I needed to see what was going on inside. I knew that when my supervisor noticed I didn't come back, I would be fired. Or worse. If Brett showed up and they figured out I was lying, I could be in serious trouble. It was worth it. I hated this job anyways. The man brought me into the room. He pointed to a conveyor belt that led into a machine. The cans will come in this side. The machine will seal them, and they will come out the other side sealed and with a label. Your job is to make sure they are sealed. If you see any leaking, pull them and place them in this barrel, okay? I nodded. It was simple. I wanted to look around to see what was causing the noise, but the cans began flowing in. Cans of peas were moving into the machine and coming out sealed. I watched them for several minutes and didn't see any that had failed to seal, but I did notice that all of them were dented. I decided to turn and ask the man what to do with the dented cans. It would be the perfect excuse to look around the room. As I turned the corner around a large piece of equipment, I saw it. A huge green insect was standing there. It was easily 6 feet tall and resembled a praying mantis. The creature was chained to the floor and vomited violently into a 55-gallon barrel. 2 men were scooping the vomit and pouring small amounts into each can of peas as they passed by. I screamed in disgust. The man who had led me into the room turned to me. He ran over and began to yell at me. You need to get back to your station. If one of those cans get through unsealed, it can ruin everything. Within hours of it being exposed to air, these eggs can hatch. He screamed at me. Eggs? What is that thing? I demanded. Fuck. Tom didn't brief you before he sent you down here? He asked. I said nothing. I just stared in horror at the giant insect. Yeah, eggs. That thing is an alien. We have an arrangement with their species. It stays here, lays eggs, and we spread them through the food chain. We estimate about 1 in 100 eggs that are consumed by a human will hatch, consuming the human from within, he explained. Why would you do this? I asked. I wanted to puke. The huge insect was staring at me while it continued to vomit. Brett, you were supposed to have been up to speed already. We don't have a choice. They supply us with tech, and we have to offer hosts to incubate their offspring. The cans are dented so we can track how many we put into circulation. And at least the only people that will be lost are poor people and cheap people looking for a bargain. He told me. That was it. I couldn't hold back anymore. I ran to the trash can and vomited. The man patted me on the shoulder. Brett, I need you to get back to your station. Besides, it's not half as bad as what they're doing with the corn. What can I get for you, sir? I believe those were the first words I said to him. He was a frail and skinny man, the kind of person that could be picked up by a strong wind and sent into the upper atmosphere. He hastily scanned the menu, eyes almost popping out of their sockets. They stopped over the big breakfast. He slid a bony finger over the printed text to indicate his choice. He didn't blink once. The big breakfast. Excellent, I chimed. It was really quite the opposite. The cooks were going to hate receiving this order. It was the biggest item on the menu, and we had only just started doing all-day breakfast. I doubted he'd get through it all. In a hope to get him to reconsider, I stated what was included. 3 waffles, 2 cheese Kranskis, a scoop of vanilla ice cream with a mega side of bacon and scrambled eggs. He didn't say anything. In fact, he was yet to say something. He simply nodded and remained pointing at the item. Strange. You always get at least 1 loose unit per shift. There was a collective groan amongst the 2 cooks as I slid the docket up. Usually Tuesday nights are quiet, and we like to keep it that way as much as possible. We can be lazy workers sometimes. Then again, the bullshit of hospitality really isn't worth the effort. That'll give you something to do over the last 4 hours. Jimmy was always an enthusiastic manager. Sometimes overbearingly so. It did at least make the shifts go quicker, and on this particular evening, we needed it. We were open until midnight. I don't know why the head office had us serving that late, especially since we hardly ever had customers beyond dinner. However, the pay was significantly better the later it got, making it that little bit more tolerable. Jimmy peered out of the kitchen and observed our single customer. He turned to me. Did our friend here want any drinks? No, just the food. Wasn't really much of a talker, I explained. Jimmy and myself looked back at the man. He sat rigidly, staring straight ahead as if in a trance. No clanging of metal from the kitchen would stir him to observe his surroundings. Gosh, these hours always bring out the weird creatures. I chuckled at Jimmy's remark. He turned around to the kitchen staff and raised his voice for all to hear. They also bring up the wages. I think I'm going to have to start sending some people home. There were 4 of us working that night. Myself, Jimmy, and 2 cooks. I knew I was safe from being sent home early as I had been employed fairly recently. My wage was cheap as chips in comparison to some of the other higher-ranked employees. One of the cooks nominated himself to leave. I think he'd recently become a father or something and wanted to get home to his kid. He punched out and disappeared into the night. Then there were 3. 15 minutes later, a bell chimed. Food was up. I put down the wine glasses I had been polishing and whisked the meal over to our strange customer. As I placed the meal in front of him, I realized I hadn't provided cutlery. Before I could apologize, the man lunged into the food, grabbing and tearing at pieces with his hands. I had to stifle a laugh, which formed out of pure shock. He continued shoving the food into his mouth like a wild animal. I composed myself. Sir, would you like me to get you a knife and fork? He ignored me and continued devouring a sausage. I scanned the table for a hidden camera or a phone pointed my way. I assumed my reaction could be getting filmed as some prank for the internet. That was the only logical explanation I could think of for this uncanny behavior. Much to my confusion, there was nothing. I returned to the kitchen, still slightly aghast, still silently processing. I told Jimmy and the remaining cook what had just occurred. They peered over to catch a glimpse, but he was already done. The show was over. Disappointed he'd missed out on the very little entertainment this job provides, Jimmy sent me back over to clear the plates. I was a little nervous walking back to his table. The stranger seemed to not be all there mentally, and I didn't really want to interact with him anymore. I mean, he hadn't said anything, but I still had this feeling churning inside of me, like I sensed something unnatural. "How was everything?" I asked. Once again, he gave me nothing. I noticed his plate had been licked clean. I reached over to begin clearing it. He jolted forward and snatched my wrist. I didn't even have time to react. We locked eyes. His hand was freezing. Raising an index finger, he pointed towards the menu. It landed on the big breakfast once more. Words nervously escaped my mouth. "Would you like another one?" He nodded slowly and released his grip. An unwelcoming smile climbed up his face. Its lines disappeared into deep dimples. His eyes flicked back to their blank stare, no longer recognizing my presence. I paced back to the kitchen and flung the docket up above the hot plate. I wanted to find Jimmy and tell him about the unwanted grabbing of the weird customer, but he seemed to be missing. Probably in his office sorting out that week's wages. I braced myself for an annoyed remark from the remaining cook. He looked at it for a beat before opening his mouth. Gosh, this fella is hungry. George was the cook's name. He had been working at the joint since the early days and had his methods down to a T. He immediately began squeezing the scrambled egg mixture into a sizzling pan. I knew it wasn't my fault, but I felt the urge to apologize for the stranger's additional order. "Sorry, George. He doesn't look it, but this customer has an appetite of a hippo." "Nah, don't stress it, bud. More than happy to be earning that late night coin." "Oh, are you an expensive hire?" "The most expensive." George laughed. "I've been here so long that I've worked my way up to top of the pay ranks. Got myself a pretty good deal from the old management. I know the new owners hate it. They'd fire me if they could, but they don't have enough trained staff in the kitchen. Plus," George skillfully threw 3 waffles onto the hot plate as he talked, "contract says I can't be fired for being good at my job." Within a matter of minutes, the second big breakfast was served up. I made sure to bring cutlery over to the table this time, but it made no difference. The stranger chowed down the meal ferociously with his bare hands, just like before. He violently gnashed the mushed egg beneath his teeth, which crunched alongside the crisp bits of waffle. The wet smacking of his lips was unbearable. I immediately retreated back to the kitchen and stayed there. When the time came for me to collect his plate, a feeling of dread rose in my chest. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Once again, the plate had been licked clean, but this time the man was already pointing at the same spot on the menu. I sighed. "Another one?" He nodded. Over the remaining hours of the shift, I must have served him over 10 plates of the big breakfast. I felt incredibly bad for George, who, despite his skill level, was struggling to meet the customer's consistent demands. It was insane. We only had one customer, but it felt like a busy Sunday morning at the rate he was eating. Each time I approached the customer, his appearance became more and more revolting. His hands glistened under the downlights, malaised in grease and maple syrup. Sauce dribbled down his chin and pooled into a puddle on the table. I will never understand how a man of that size could consume so much. At 12 a.m., Jimmy finally made an appearance from his office. It was closing time, and George and myself were more than ready to put this shift behind us. The customer still sat at his table, drenched in his mess. We explained what had happened in great detail, but Jimmy seemed unconcerned. In fact, he seemed slightly content with the news. "Well, the profit targets are going to look amazing," he joked. Neither George or I could relate to his optimism. Jimmy must have read the look on our faces. He turned to me and changed his tone. "All right, mate, you can go home. Thanks for tonight." "What about me?" chimed George. Jimmy pointed towards me. "He's working early tomorrow, George. I just need you to quickly close up the kitchen." George wasn't satisfied with this answer. "I'm working tomorrow morning too. I've got to open. Just a quick cleanup, George. Come on. You're earning a lottery by the hour. Jimmy's response was quick and stern. I'd never seen that side of him before. George banged a pan against the stove with frustration. Ignoring his outburst, Jimmy turned back to me. You can go now, mate. Cheers. As I threw on my coat and walked down the restaurant aisle, I passed the customer. He was still there. The man chuckled to himself while holding his blank stare. I should have kept walking, but the shock of the shift had me fired up. We've closed now, sir. We're going to have to ask you to pay and leave. I almost spat the words and immediately regretted it. The man snapped his head towards me and uttered his first and only words. The entree is done. Now time for the main. He giggled and returned to his vacant expression. I didn't really know what he meant by the main, but I wasn't going to find out. I drove a little faster on the way home that evening. When I sluggishly strolled into the kitchen the following morning, I noticed there was no sign of George. Instead, Jimmy stood over the hot plate, lathering it with oil in preparation for the morning rush. He looked towards me and beamed. Morning, mate. Sleep well? Where's George? I blurted. Jimmy's eyebrows dropped. He wasn't too happy about last night, mate, and well, he quit. He quit? Yeah, I know. Shame to see him go. Extremely unprofessional to just walk out like that. Jimmy scraped the surface of the metal plate with a spatula. Not to worry though, mate. He was really expensive. We're gonna get you into the kitchen now. How's that for fun? My mind was struggling to keep up with everything. Nothing sounded right. George didn't seem like the guy to do that. Not after all the years he'd been at the restaurant. What about the customer, I asked. The customer last night? Did he pay? The spatula scratched the plate with an awful screech. Oh yeah. He said the meal was awesome and your service was excellent. My brain was hurting with confusion. I could feel the blood thumping in my skull. He actually said that? You bet. Funny you should mention him. I didn't want to make you nervous last night, but he's actually from upper management. Technically my boss. Came in for a little inspection and made sure business was good. Adrenaline shot up my legs. My heart beat like a drum. An eyelid twitched. My mind raced back to George, stating he was an expensive employee. The most expensive employee. The result of an old contract from the restaurant's initial owners. A contract that the current management did not like. I thought back to the previous night's customer, now revealed to be a member of upper management. I thought back to him mentioning that it was time for the main as I exited the store. If Jimmy works for him, that means... I don't think George quit. Jimmy chuckled before continuing. And let me tell you, mate, business is fucking good. I hated campfire stories growing up. My parents made me go to summer camps where people who couldn't stand their kids ditched them. Why bother having kids if you couldn't stand to be around them during the summer? My parents told me it was for enrichment, whatever that meant. Make friends, get to know people, have a good time. Well, nothing is good about being forced to choke on wood smoke while getting sucked dry by mosquitoes. All the while, some dickhead named Counselor Todd told a cheesy campfire story. Worst was when cool Counselor Chadley accompanied on his guitar. Anyway, as I said, I hated these stories growing up. I always had really vivid dreams, along with an overactive imagination. Those stories that blurred the lines between reality and fiction made both go haywire, and my mind became trapped in a spiral of what-if scenarios. Always watching the shadows of the cabin walls as the moonlight made the branches stretch like fingers. Feeling breath on my ear when it was just the AC. The groan of my bunkmate's bed springs was some horrible killer dragging his sickle along the floor. I think the worst story Todd ever told was about the deer woman. It is nothing like the Native American tales of shape-shifting women, where men are lured away to be stomped to death by their hooves, or stories of transformation. No, Todd's deer woman was something much more horrific. It was something like this woman was driving down a road close to the camp and hit a deer. Upon impact, she went through the windshield and collided with the deer's head, embedding the skull and antlers into her face. When the police and ambulance arrived, they found the deer's mangled body, the crushed car, and a set of bloody footprints leading off into the woods. They never found the woman. Legend says she still haunts the forest around the camp to this very day. Todd said to his terrified masses. The shadows playing over his face made him look demonic. After enduring 3 weeks of Todd's dramatics, I was over the spooky firelight trick. But the story freaked me out. I was already devastated at the idea of driving. The very thought of driving along some dark, winding road only to slam into a deer was terrifying. Then mix that in with having my crumpled, broken remains mashed with the deer corpse. F that. The other stuff about the woman walking away to haunt the forest was obviously BS though. My fear of anything curvine in nature wasn't so sure. Don't judge me. Deer are freaky looking. And have you ever heard of an elk bugle? Haunting. So the story itself was playing on my imagination a little. Anything vaguely horn-like had my skin crawling, which my fellow campers thought was super hilarious. Then the night only got worse. It was already late. Being in the middle of June, the sun was still lighting the sky around 9 p.m., so the scary stories hadn't commenced until about 10 o'clock. Now the horrible hour of midnight was slowly approaching, and tonight was supposed to be a camp-wide hide-and-seek spotlight tag event. The whole thing sounded horrible. Why allow campers armed with only a flashlight and wits to hide anywhere on the campgrounds? There were restrictions like no one was allowed to hide in the woods. Still, the situation sounded dubious at best. Nevertheless, campers who saw the flawed logic of such a game were not permitted to stay on the bench. So, I played against my will. At first, I tried to hide somewhere obvious, so I could be found and made to sit out early. That plan was foiled when Counselor Chad came up and looked at me with that expression you'd give to an obnoxious toddler. "Come on, dude," he said in his chattiest tone. "I know you don't like these games, but you gotta at least try, man. I'm gonna turn around and count again, and this time you better find a good place to hide. 'Kay? 1, 2... He was really going to make me do this. Fine. If I had to play, I'd play to win, and give them a scare for once. I ran from my spot under the picnic tables down the road towards the best hiding place I knew. About half a mile from the actual campground sat a collection of abandoned buildings that had been part of the camp at one point. All the buildings had fallen into disrepair. Some had boarded windows and doors. The areas were littered with broken glass. Many of them were stuffed with old furniture and hardware like ovens, fridges, and those serving tables you'd see at buffets. Plenty of broken bunk beds, mattresses, dressers. In other words, things to hide under. Was I afraid of the potential spider and tetanus hazard? Sure, but the drive to stick it to those annoying camp jockeys spurred me. Still not sure about what happened after that. After I found a place to hide, tucked away under a collection of discarded bunk beds, I watched the windows for signs of the flashlights. I felt pretty good of myself, not gonna lie. They would be searching for me for hours. Would I get in trouble for this? Probably. Would it get me sent home? God, I hope so. I remember being in that abandoned cabin for a long time, far longer than I thought I would be. I didn't have a watch or phone with me, so I couldn't tell what time it was. Boredom started to take its toll after a while. The longer time went without any of the counselors coming to find me, the more I considered crawling out from my hiding place and walking back to my cabin. A horrible stench reached my nose just as I decided that enough was enough. It was probably the worst thing I had ever smelled, and someone had exploded a can of fart spray in my high school wood shop class last year. So that was saying something. Whatever it was clear that something had died nearby. I hoped it wasn't anywhere close to my hiding place. You'd think I'd have noticed a dead thing sooner, but then I heard the sound of something walking. I say something, and not someone, because the rhythm was off. There was a kind of loping, dragging noise. There were too many legs for a person, but it wasn't enough for an animal. Step, 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 drag. Step, 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 drag. The hairs on the back of my neck and arms stood up. A knot formed in my gut, and a little voice of self-preservation screamed that something wasn't right. The sound drew closer, the scent of death growing more intense with each step. Then my ears caught the inhale and exhale of ragged breaths, as if whatever it was attempting to breathe through a wet towel. Something thick and liquidy fell in heavy drops onto the ground, like someone was carrying a bucket of water, and some of it was sloshing out. Then there was the buzzing of flies. As I stared out the window nearest my hiding place, I could see the black clouds swirling in the moonlight. Not long after, a shadowy figure stumbled into view. My mind whirled to place the jumble of shapes and forms into some kind of order. The thing appeared humanoid in the way it moved, but I saw a set of massive deer-like antlers and a slender animal face sitting atop a long, broken neck. S'more-flavored bile rose in my throat as my eyes picked out stripes of hanging flesh through the dirt-covered windows. As the thing lumbered to the cabin door, I forced myself to be still, forced my breathing to be silent, forced my bladder to not piss myself in terror. The creature pushed the door open. Its dreadful, dull creak filled the still air like the last dying groan of a wounded animal. Step, 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 drag. Step, 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 drag. It lurched and lumbered across the floor, carried by two broken humanoid legs with one deer leg trailing behind. The stench from earlier hit my nose with a force that nearly made my stomach revolt. Blood and bile dripped from the dislocated jaw onto the floor. Shadows enveloped the creature's face, but I knew it was looking for me. This couldn't be real. Monsters and things that searched for little kids in the woods didn't exist in real life. This had to be some kind of sick prank Todd and the others were playing. One of them had seen me run off to the abandoned camp area. They got all dressed up and covered themselves in whatever foul-smelling spray this was to scare me. They knew how overreactive my imagination was, and were messing with me. The thing drew closer. If this was a prank, it wasn't funny. I wanted to scream for whoever it was to cut it out, go back to the camp and tell the others that they found me. However, something in the back of my mind clamped down on my throat. A primal sense that screamed that this thing was not a person. Step, 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 drag. The creature stopped in front of my hiding place. My stomach rolled at the stench of decay. What little light that cut through the grimy windows illuminated pale, misshapen purple-blue legs. Bones cracked as it bent in half to peer into my den. Bloody and maggoty bile dripped from its broken deer jaw, and one of the empty eye sockets. Hot, putrid breath hit my face, and I could feel my mouth fill with saliva as nausea teetered on the edge of release. We stared at each other for a mind-numbing amount of time. Silence stretched on and weighed heavy and cold like the hand of death. Not knowing what else to do, I pointed one trembling finger down toward the door. With a voice filled with tears and terror, I said, The hospital. The hospital is that way. The dear woman continued her silent stare for a few minutes more. I thought my racing heart would kill me before she decided to, as I stared into her one dull black eye. Then, like a rubber toy, her body slumped in half before rolling back up. Each of her vertebrae popped and cracked as she stood. Finally, she turned and made her slow, shambling way out of the building, and away in the direction I pointed. Step, 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 drag. Step, step, step. Drag. I'm sure I passed out after she disappeared. Or maybe I went into some kind of blacked out state of panic. I can't really remember. I know I had returned to the camp at some point with everyone in a frenzy looking for me. Even the police and ambulance had been called. Everyone was ready to give me a stern talking to, until one of the EMTs noticed the shock on my face. In a way, I got my wish because I was taken to the hospital, and later picked up by my parents to go home. And before you ask, no one believed me. Why would they? The story sounded impossible. I want to believe it was impossible because things like that aren't real. They only exist in stories told around dumb campfires to susceptible imaginations like mine. So now that you've heard my story, who wants to play hide and seek?